most people associate C.S. Lewis with Magdalen College, but to talk about his Oxford life means to begin at the beginning, which was as a student at UNIV, University College, where he began in April 1917. This is his matriculation photo. It's a somewhat unusual time to have started a degree, of course. The academic year doesn't really usually begin in the summer term. But of course, that was an unusual time to be coming to Oxford at all during the First World War. And this I find quite a moving picture, because this is the whole of the undergraduate body at UNIV in Trinity term 1917, because most of them, of course, were on the front line. And Lewis himself didn't do a lot of study in that first term here. He did cram for the mathematics component of responsions, which was one of several examinations that you had to take to become a student at the university. It doesn't matter what you were studying in those days, you had to pass responsions in mathematics. So he began work on that, but he was also training with the Officer Training Cadet Force in preparation for his own entry into the army. His subject at this point was Literae Humaniores, i.e. classics. So we think of him again, associate him with Magdalen, but also with English as a discipline. But he began as a classics student here at UNIV. And pretty soon after, he moved to Keble College, where he joined an officer cadet battalion. This is a picture of him. You'll see it in the exhibition a bit more close up, but here he is in uniform, ready to go into the Somerset Light Infantry. So it wasn't long before he found himself signed up and ready for action. In fact, November of the same year, 1917, on his 19th birthday, he was in France in the trenches. So we'll skip forward a bit. What happened is he was very much involved in fighting, and in April of 1918, he was badly wounded at the Battle of Arras, which actually saved his life, ironically, because it was what meant he got sent back to England to recover in a military hospital. The close friend of his, who was standing next to him at the time and who he wrote very warmly about in his letters of the period, who also had a scholarship like Lewis to study classics, but at Queen's College, was killed by the same shell. So you realise that, you know, many of these brilliant young men like Lewis never really got their chance to come to Oxford and fulfil that potential. Lewis survived, he recovered in the hospital, and he then was back home in Belfast, where he was born, for Christmas of 1918. And then he returned to Oxford, and he came back to do his studies in classics in earnest. At the end of his first year, he got a first in prelims, and then at the end of his third year, he got a first in greats, so a double first in classics. Pretty good if you want to do what he did, which was to go on to an academic career. And in fact, at that point, he wanted to become a professional academic philosopher. And he applied for his first job. And in those days, you know, you could move pretty much from a decent undergraduate degree to, in his case, what he was looking for was a fellowship in classics. And one opened up here at Magdalen. And he was one of this group of 11 students who were setting out, who were sort of applied to for this, we still call a fellowship by examination here at Magdalen. Other colleges would call it a junior research fellowship. So it's a sort of temporary 3-year post where you do research in the college. But it's called fellowship by examination because in those days you did have to sit a pretty daunting set of exams. You can see the whole list of what he had to do as part of this application. And it's actually what became a very distinguished set of applicants there. So E.R. Dodds went on to become the Regius Professor of Greek, for instance, and H.H. Price, who's the man who actually got the job from New College there, number 10, he went on to become the Wickham Professor of Logic at New College. And Lewis was unsuccessful in his application. And in fact, you can see in the exhibition the rejection letter that he got from President Warren, which said, you know, although you did yourself well, you acquitted yourself well, actually you didn't quite come up to the standard. He's returning to him his essay that he submitted as part of the application, which was on the hegemony of moral value, which President Warren claims to have read in detail and says that he was very much interested in it, but didn't think he'd quite managed to work out the original idea to a clear effect and conclusion. But it does sort of hint at the idea that the Fellows of Magdalen did think pretty highly of Lewis, and that the gates of Magdalen hadn't closed on him completely by this time. And at the top of the letter, he refers to the fact that Lewis is at this time reading for the English school. And this was the next stage of his academic career. While he was applying for jobs, his then tutor at UNIV, a chap called E.F. Carrot, suggested to him that it might be a good idea if he carried on his studies and did the English degree, because in those days English was a new subject in Oxford, and he felt that there might be more opportunities for him with a fellowship in English than there were in classics. And of course, by this stage, Lewis, as a sort of precociously bookish young man, had read much of the English syllabus. He was particularly interested in the medieval period, and in those days the Oxford English syllabus was very focused on the Middle Ages. So Lewis had already read much of the curriculum, which meant that he could do the whole degree in just 1 year. And so he then, while he was sort of looking around for things to do, did an English degree and got another first in it. So at this point he has 3 firsts. And the advice that Carrot gave him turned out to be extremely good advice, because at that point when he finished the degree, a job opened up here at Magdalen for the first tutorial fellowship in English. So at that point most colleges didn't have English tutors, and Magdalen advertised, and Lewis successfully applied for it. Although I say that he'd read much of the English syllabus at this time, there were bits of it that were still rather foreign to him and which he did not exactly warm to. And that particularly was the area of what's known as philology, the scientific study of the English language. And as a student, Lewis found himself attending the lectures of this man, H.C. Wilde, who was the professor of English language at Merton College. And one of the nice things I found while I was doing my research for this book was Lewis's own copy of the textbook that Wilde wrote that he used for his lectures, The Short History of English. In it, Lewis has written a number of satirical poems in which which are sort of somewhat hostile to the lecturer himself. He's written them, again, rather precociously. This one's in Latin. And then there's one in Old English, which Lewis has only just started learning at that point. And then there's one in Greek and one in French. The Old English one I've translated here, and you can see it's really a sort of tissue of bits of Old English poems that he would have been studying. Any poem that has something kind of unpleasant about somebody, he borrowed it and applied it to Wilde, hateful to the saviour, wicked scholar. And then at the end, his belly was wider than that of any man. So Lewis really took against the study of the English language, and particularly against this figure of H.C. Wilde. Of course, he then went on to work alongside him in the Oxford English faculty. So 1925 then was the year in which Lewis first came to Magdalen as the tutorial fellow in English. And of course, nowadays we have 3 tutorial fellows in English. In those days, Lewis was the only one. So of course, he was teaching very widely. I said he was principally interested in the medieval period, but of course he would have also have taught Shakespeare, and in those days the course went just about as far as the Victorian period. He also was asked by the president when he took the job if he would be willing to take the students doing philosophy as well. So he taught philosophy. He also taught political theory to the historians. So he had a pretty wide range of subjects to teach, and a pretty heavy, daunting teaching schedule. And here he is in his rooms. I should have said that the rooms that he moved into, unhelpfully, this picture doesn't have there's normally those sort of red flowers at the front of John Gregg's rooms there, and you can always describe Lewis as the 3 windows to the right of those. But here, if you think of you can see the central section, it's the second floor up. The 3 windows just to the right of that were 2 of his rooms, and here he is in them. So it was here that he began his teaching career, and he was a pretty daunting figure to be taught by, especially in those early days in the 1920s. Most famously, in his kind of rather tempestuous relationship with one of his first undergraduates, the poet John Betjeman. And Lewis and Betjeman really did not get on. You might have thought two very literary men, Lewis in those days was an aspiring poet as well, but they would have got on, but they really didn't. I mean, part of the problem, I suppose, is that Betjeman, his interests were much more in the kind of arcane areas of the Victorian period, and he was not interested in the Middle Ages, and he certainly wasn't keen to learn Anglo-Saxon, Old English. And Lewis's diary of the time is full of references to somewhat lightweight essays that have been produced by Betjeman, or a string of implausible excuses. He was always ringing him up and saying that he'd got measles or something and couldn't come to the tutorial. And so he got particularly fed up with Betjeman and his lack of industry. And in his diary, he writes at one point, "I wish I could get rid of this idle prig." But if that seems unduly harsh on Betjeman, then it wasn't out of, it wasn't that different to what he says about some of his other students, a useless lump, or of another tutorial pair, a desperately stupid pair. He had pretty exacting standards, especially in those days. But it was Betjeman that was causing him most of his difficulties. And we see that in the tutorial board minutes for the Michaelmas term 1926, there's a record of the decision of the committee that Mr. Betjeman should be informed that the board is not satisfied with his industry. And you can really trace Betjeman's career using these records of the college internal exams known as collections during his time here. So you can see here, Michaelmas term 1925, he starts quite brightly and he gets himself an alpha. But here we are by Hilary term 1928, and he's got the only delta in the entire undergraduate body. And there's also a reference here, so English, Holy Scripture. What that means is that this is the reference to another of the responsions exams that you have to pass to become a student in the university. You can start your degree without having passed it, but you have to keep taking it until you pass it. And for Betjeman, the problem was Holy Scripture, or DIVAS, as it was known, the divinity exam, which he failed on multiple occasions. And in fact, in the end, he was rusticated, i.e. sent home, to revise for the Holy Scripture exam so that he could come back and pass it successfully. And when he came back, he failed it. And at that point, he then had to appeal to the tutorial board to be admitted for a pass degree. And they basically turned to Lewis and said, "Would you support him?" And Lewis said no. And so that was at the point at which Betjeman was sent down. So he left without a degree at all. And he never forgave Lewis for not supporting him, although quite why he thought Lewis would support him, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I guess you could say that Lewis might have been a bit more sympathetic to the fact that he didn't pass responsions, because I mentioned earlier that Lewis came up to Oxford April 1917 to cram for the mathematics responsions, which he failed. And in fact, when he came back to Oxford, the only reason that he got in at all was because the university decided that any returning ex-serviceman should be excused responsions. Because otherwise, I think it's quite doubtful as to whether he'd have ever passed mathematics. Betjeman, as I say, never really quite forgave him for it and never passed up an opportunity to make some kind of sniping remark about his former tutor in a publication. And here he is in the foreword, the preface to Continual Dew, a collection of poetry he published in 1937, where he thanks Lord Longford for correcting the proofs and doing the orthography, never a strong point of the author's, and says that he's indebted to Mr. C.S. Lewis for the fact on page 256, but there are only 45 pages in the volume. These kinds of remarks go on throughout his whole career. And Betjeman wasn't the only person who really did not take to Lewis's teaching methods and to particularly the teaching of Anglo-Saxon. Henry Yorke, who was a contemporary of Betjeman's, who went on to become a distinguished novelist under the pseudonym Henry Green, he dropped out without a degree as well. I don't know if there's some sort of pattern here to people reading English dropping out without the degree and becoming distinguished writers. He published 9 novels as Henry Green, and his autobiography, Pack My Bag, he writes of his time at Oxford that I found I had to learn Anglo-Saxon. This I could not do. And so he gave up at that point. But not all students had such a negative attitude to their time at Oxford and to the study of Anglo-Saxon with Lewis. Edward Snyders, who started his Magdalen undergraduate English career at the beginning of the Second World War and then had to take time out to go and fly bombers with the RAF. So he did one term with Lewis before going off, and then he says in his memoir that he, having spent this year at Magdalen before flying mosquitoes, that it was, so he was shot down and confined in a prisoner of war camp, Stalag Luft 3. And having tried to escape, he found himself then in solitary confinement. And he said that it was the memories of that year with Lewis and what he called the stark beauty of Anglo-Saxon that actually comforted him during that period of exile and confinement. And Lewis, in fact, wrote to Snyders to try and offer him comfort during his period as a prisoner of war, and said to him, don't let your studies go while you're there. Make sure you keep up your reading. I've enclosed a reading list. And Snyders sort of quite reasonably wrote back and said, "But thanks very much, Mr. Lewis, but we don't really have the books that I'll need for that." And so Lewis just started sending him all the books. And so in fact, he was able to keep up with his reading during his period as a prisoner of war. And Derek Brewer was another example of a student who flourished under Lewis's tuition. He, although he was described by Lewis once as lacking in pep in a tutorial report, Brewer went on to become one of the most distinguished Chaucer scholars of his generation and later on the master of Emmanuel College, Cambridge. And there's a lovely letter that survives in which Lewis is writing to Brewer before he comes up as a student and giving him instructions as to what he should read as preparation for the course. And it's a pretty daunting list of stuff. So he tells him he has to read all of the great classical works. Make sure you've read the Odyssey and the Aeneid and the Iliad. And he said, and if you can't scan Latin hexameters, learn how to. Doesn't actually tell him how he should go about doing that. And then he says it's very important that you know all of the biblical stories that lie behind much of English literature. So make sure you read the Bible. And it's a good idea to read it in the Latin Vulgate, because that is very easy Latin and it will help you keep your Latin up. And then he gets on to the business of actually reading the English literature he'll be studying. And again, it's a daunting list of the works of Chaucer, of Gower, Spenser, Milton, Shelley, Swift, and so on, all before he's even begun the degree. And then he finishes off by saying, the great thing is to be always reading, but not to get bored. Treat it not like work, more as a vice. Your book bill ought to be your biggest extravagance. And so being taught by Lewis was a pretty intense kind of encounter. Accounts of people who had tutorials with him, sitting in his rooms, taking an essay along, and then having to read it out to Lewis and wait to find out what his response might be. And he certainly took things pretty personally. He was pretty passionate about the subject. There's a nice story of somebody who having had a tutorial with Lewis, found himself walking down the wooden stairs of the new buildings, and then Lewis leaning down after him shouting, "If you feel that way about Keats, you needn't bother coming back again." So, you could disagree with him, but not about certain things. And there's another nice story about how he fell out with a student about the merits of the poem by Sohrab and Rustum. And as a result, Lewis shouts, "Let the swords decide it," and hands the student a rapier. And then they had a kind of, sort of fencing match, a duel over it, which, according to one of Lewis's colleagues who was actually present, Lewis drew blood. And the other thing I think people found difficult with Lewis and being taught by him is knowing quite how the essay was going down as they delivered it, because he was such a heavy smoker that his whole head was kind of wreathed in smoke the whole time. So you couldn't actually tell, is he enjoying this? Does he think it's good? What's his reaction going to be? And Sir Gunter Treitel, who was a fellow here in law for a time, told me a nice story about when he came up as a hopeful scholarship boy as a 17-year-old. He was vivaed by Lewis, and what he recalls was sitting in a room with him being asked about the Canterbury Tales, and all he could see was, in this huge cloud of smoke, was Lewis's little bald head just sticking out the top of it. And what an intimidating kind of experience that was. And one of the things I also found while I was doing the research for the book was a number of tutorial reports of the kind that tutors still write today on their students. And one interesting thing about Lewis was not only that he had a heavy teaching load here at Magdalen, but also that he continued to be a lecturer at Univ for a long time after he left there. And he taught at New College for a time, and also in a number of the ladies' colleges as well. I said English tutors in Oxford were in short supply in those days. And so Lewis taught very widely, including at St Hugh's College here in 1930. And this was one of my favourite reports that I found, in which he says of the Miss Beebe he's reporting on that she's an excellent pupil as far as essays go, industrious and very intelligent, but that she's somewhat reticent and reserved when it comes to discussions in tutorials. And he says perhaps if she'd knitted or smoked during tutorials, it would have been better, less intense. I can't imagine trying to sort of put that in a report today. But you can see even then the senior tutor has put a little exclamation mark in the margin there, obviously thinking that was a somewhat unusual comment. And as well as dealing with undergraduate students, Lewis also encountered and was engaged in the teaching and assessment of the postgraduate degree, what was known as the B.Lit in those days. Another example of a student who was taught by him as an undergraduate was John Wayne. This again is someone who went on to become a famous poet. In fact, he was also the poet laureate, but not from Magdalen, but a student at St John's just during and after the war. And this is quite a nice piece of evidence that I found again that tells us something about what it was like to be in a tutorial with Lewis. His collection of essays are part of his collected papers that have been deposited at the Bodleian. So reading through those, you get not only what the essay was about that he wrote this one here, but he also gives us a little synopsis of the discussion afterwards. So you can see it here at the end of his essay, where he's finished writing it. And I don't know how accurate or verbatim this is as a quotation of Lewis's response to his essays, but if it is, it suggests that he was pretty straight talking when it came to expressing his views on it, balls from beginning to end. You were all confused. How many writers can you name who were really involved in what you describe as this tumultuous vortex of 17th century controversy? And you can see he hazards a few examples there, Milton and so on, and then Lewis says, well, what about Traherne and so on? And then at the end he goes, me, bugger me. And so it doesn't seem to have gone very well for Wayne at that point. You can see, you get a sense of the way in which he was being challenged immediately with all of the things that he had tried to claim in his essay. The B.Lit students have a similar kind of experience, especially when it comes to being examined by Lewis. Lewis was famously somewhat sceptical of the idea of a research degree. He thought it's fine to go on reading and learning more, but the idea of just sort of doing research in order to get a qualification at the end of it, he thought was kind of the wrong way round. And he divided up the English faculty into the literate, the illiterate, and the B-literate, who were really the worst kind. And this is his report that I found in the university archives of the thesis that was submitted by Mr. Cassidy on the life and work of Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey. And this is what Lewis wrote in the report, the examiners. We found that Mr. Cassidy's thesis adds nothing to what is already known of the subject, and that his general knowledge of English literature, even within the 16th century, is inadequate. So, of course, he was sent back with this thesis. He did not pass. He was referred. But brave Mr. Cassidy did not give up at that point. He went off. He spent a year working on the thesis, and he resubmitted it and got Lewis again as an examiner. Yeah, exactly. And here's the report on the revised thesis. Although we found Mr. Cassidy's general knowledge of English literature so very inadequate as almost to disqualify him for the degree, the biographical part of his thesis appeared to us to be adequate. And with that, he got his degree and was presumably quite relieved. So that's sort of, some insights into what it was like to be taught and examined by Lewis. And now I want to say a bit about him as a colleague, as a member of the SCR, the Senior Common Room here at Magdalen. And this is the picture that you can see, the original of it, just to the side here, of him and his colleagues at the time sitting around in the common room having dessert. This is that's him just on the far right there, you can see. It's, of course, a tradition that those of us who are members of the SCR here will be familiar with, that on special occasions before dinner, fellows and their guests weigh each other on this rather old-fashioned and strange contraption and enter the weight into the weights book. It seems kind of normal to us, but I gather to others it seems like a very odd thing to do. But it's quite interesting because Lewis appears in the Magdalen SCR weights book twice. Rather unfortunately for him, once sort of early on in his career, you'll see that in the exhibition in the early 1930s when he weighs in at just over 13 stone. And then just before he left the college in 1954, where he weighs in at 14 stone 13. So you can actually see exactly how much weight he put on while he was at fellow at Magdalen. So that's a nice detail. Another sort of strange college tradition is that when fellows are sitting around in the SCR debating or sitting over dessert debating some kind of abstruse academic point and they then sort of disagree over it and it can't be reconciled, they can often turn to the SCR betting book and place a bet on the outcome of it. And there's one example of this where in 1946, Lewis and the ancient history tutor C.E. Stevens have a bet on whether the word eros appears in Homer's Odyssey, and their stake is a bottle of port. And you can see that Lewis turns out to be right, paid up by Mr. Stevens. So you'd think the ancient history tutor ought to know better, but I would never argue with Lewis over a point of detail like that. Another aspect of Lewis's life as a fellow at Magdalen was as a member of a number of groups and societies, some which he formed himself and others which were formed by friends and colleagues. One of these is the Coalbiters, which was an old Icelandic reading group formed by the newly appointed Professor of Anglo-Saxon there on the left, J.R.R. Tolkien. So Tolkien at this point had just returned to Oxford himself, having spent several years teaching at the University of Leeds. And he was keen to promote the study of Old Icelandic, which was a particular interest of his. And so he formed this group known as the Coalbiters, or the Coalbitar in Old Icelandic. And it's so called because in the Old Icelandic sagas, it's a kind of scornful name for people who, instead of like going off and fighting bravely and pillaging, they stay at home and sit round the fire so close to it that they look like they're biting the coals. So what he did was he set up this group and he invited a number of prominent philologists within the university, a number of them connected with Magdalen. So K.B. Macfarlane here was the medieval history tutor here and a good friend of Lewis's. C.T. Onions, the editor of the Oxford English Dictionary, was also a fellow of Magdalen. In fact, he did most of the editing of the dictionary sitting in one of the bays of the old library where you'll see the exhibition. And then here, this chap is George Gordon, who was the president of Magdalen. And then there were various other distinguished linguists and philologists. And along with them, he invited Lewis himself, who he met for the first time when he came to Oxford at that point in early 1926, when the Coalbiters was founded. And Lewis and Tolkien became good friends quite quickly with their shared interests. And Lewis himself had been greatly influenced and interested by Norse mythology in particular, and the old Icelandic sagas. And it had been a desire of his to study them in the original language. And he was very enthusiastic, but he did find it quite difficult. And he says in his diary at one point when he's working on Volsunga Saga, I began working on it. I felt very poorly and depressed all morning. I looked at Morris's translation in the Union, so he's already had to go to a crib to try and help him. It was difficult stuff. But one nice document that survives is a little invitation in Lewis's own hand, which was sent out to the various members of the Coalbiters on an occasion when the meeting was held here at Magdalen. And he's written it in Old Icelandic, of course. Skulu Aclia Coalbita, so all the Coalbiters must seek out the home of C.S. Lewis at Mary Magdalen College on Odin's Day, November the 20th. That's Wednesday, November the 20th, 8:30. And thine bit and your bit. Lewis obviously doesn't know the Old Icelandic word for bit, so he just uses the English word. And then it tells them which bit of the poem they have to prepare in advance. And this is really the beginning of his great friendship with Tolkien, which of course was hugely productive for both men. And there's a nice reference to a meeting at a similar moment where he talks about how busy he is. He's writing back to a friend of his in Belfast and says, I have too many irons in the fire. The Michaelmas Club, the Linguistic Society, the Icelandic Society, this and that. One week, I was up till 2:30 on Monday talking to the Anglo-Saxon professor Tolkien, who came back with me to college from a society, and sat discoursing of the gods and giants and Asgard, that's the Norse home of the gods, for 3 hours. Then departing in the wind and rain, who could turn him out? For the fire was bright and the talk good. Next night till 1, talking to someone else. I always feel slightly sorry for that person, because on about Tolkien and just some other guy. Next night till 1, talking to someone else. And then on Wednesday till 12 with the Icelandics again. So you get a sense of how busy his schedule is. He's teaching all day long, but he's then busy all evening. He also ran an undergraduate Anglo-Saxon reading group, which he called Beer and Beowulf, where they all sat round in his rooms reciting and translating parts of the Anglo-Saxon epic, and then and filling their glasses with a big barrel of beer that Lewis kept in his rooms. And again, they would be there till sort of 1 in the morning, typically. The Michaelmas Club is a reference to a society that Lewis himself set up, along with the medieval history tutor K.B. Macfarlane that I mentioned already. When he came to the college, he found that President Warren had banned all student societies because he thought they interfered with the rowing. And Lewis thought that was probably the wrong way round. And so he set up a literary philosophical reading group, which he called the Michaelmas Club. And the idea was that students would get together and read papers to each other, and sometimes he read a paper as well. And actually some of his most famous essays began life as papers that he read to the Michaelmas Club. And then they decided that they would invite external speakers once a year. And so in June 1930, and you'll see the minute book of the Michaelmas Club next door, there's a minute recording a paper read by Professor Tolkien on privately constructed languages. And we hear that he traced the growth of these through various elementary forms like animalic and nevbosh. These were things that Tolkien had been making up when he was a child. And then he he revealed some highly polished philologies of his own. So this is some of the beginnings of the Elvish languages. And in fact, it transpires that this was the very first occasion on which Lewis shared those privately constructed Elvish languages. And then it says that he went on to recount some of the poetry that he'd composed in them as well. And really frustratingly, because the student then ends off the description of this evening by saying the discussion went on long into the evening, full of interesting observations, but because I had an essay, I had an exam the next day, I had to leave early. And so you don't actually find out what they were talking about. So the relationship between Lewis and Tolkien then, I said it was very productive for both of them. And one way we see that is particularly over Lewis's or a record that Tolkien left in a letter written in the 60s, where he explains the origin of Lewis's science fiction works, which he says began life when he and Lewis were talking to each other, and Lewis said to him, "Tollers, there's too little of what we really like in stories. I'm afraid we shall have to try and write some ourselves." We agreed that he should try space travel and I should try time travel. And you'll see there's a section on these science fiction books that came out of this particular agreement in the exhibition. So Lewis then wrote Out of the Silent Planet, about a trip to Mars, or Malacandra as it's called. This is his response to that particular agreement, that he should try space travel. And in fact, it was so productive with Lewis that he then went on to write a sequel. So Out of the Silent Planet came out in 1938. Perelandra, The Voyage to Venus, came out these are sort of much later covers, by the way, which bear very little relationship to the books. If you know the stories, you might be wondering what the giant eye is doing, but I don't know. I'm not sure that the illustrators actually read the stories. But Perelandra was the sequel, and then in 1945, That Hideous Strength. So Lewis wrote a trilogy in response to that particular agreement. It's sort of characteristic of Tolkien that he began writing a work called The Lost Road, but never finished it. That was his attempt to try time travel. But I think what it shows is that relationship, even in that early point in the 1930s, we could see them already responding very much to their shared interests and to the sort of the kind of mutual encouragement. But other figures also appear at this time as well, like, for instance, Charles Williams, the writer, who Lewis started corresponding with at the end of the 1930s. When he writes to him and says, "I've written a thriller about a journey to Mars on which I urgently want your opinion." Williams then, who worked for the Oxford University Press in London, moved to Oxford when the press came to Oxford during the war to leave London. And he then sort of began to associate with Lewis, Tolkien, and with the group that came to be known as the Inklings. So the Inklings, of course, was another example of a group that met regularly, partly here at Magdalen on a Thursday night in Lewis's rooms after dinner, but also probably more famously at the Eagle and Child pub on St Giles, where they met Tuesday lunchtimes. That was more to discuss English school politics, university politics, tell stories, anecdotes, gossip, that kind of thing. The Thursday night in Magdalen was the time when they would read to each other from works that they were engaged upon. And it was particularly, I suppose, that friendship between Lewis and Tolkien that was the kind of the starting point for the Inklings. And it was a very productive time for Lewis. So these are all works that he read to the Inklings and then received sort of feedback and encouragement on The Problem of Pain, which is his first work of Christian apologetics, Out of the Silent Planet, Screwtape Letters, Perelandra, and The Great Divorce. And of course, during that period, Tolkien himself was working on what they called at the time the New Hobbit book, which was, of course, the sequel to The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings. And this is a nice document, which you'll see in the Old Library exhibition, which is a thank you note that the Inklings wrote to one of Lewis's many American supporters who'd sent them in the days of kind of rationing after the war. He sent various food packages, and at this point he'd sent them a ham, which they had cooked here in Magdalen, and in one of the private dining rooms they sat down and they ate a big dinner, and at the end they sent him this thank you letter saying that, having just partaken of your ham, the undersigned have drunk your health. And you can see who was here at the time. The Inklings had a kind of core membership and then various people satelliting around it. But here you've got C.S. Lewis, you've got Hugo Dyson, who was an English tutor at Merton, David Cecil, who was the Goldsmiths Professor of English at New College, Warnie Lewis, Lewis's brother, who'd come to live with him after leaving the army, Colin Hardy, a tutor at Classics at Magdalen, Christopher Rule Tolkien. He's the one that sort of jumps out a bit because he's an undergraduate at Trinity College. The reason he was there is because Tolkien himself, who's signed up at the bottom there, was notoriously a terrible reader of his own work, an awful mumbler. And so in the end, they got fed up of listening to him sort of mumbling away and invited Christopher to come, who was a much better projector and reader of the work. And so that's why he's there. And then we've got R.E. Havard, who was Lewis's doctor. And again, it seems like a slightly unusual fit there, but someone who himself was actually a writer, as they all were. Warnie Lewis had written a number of histories of France in the 17th century. So it was the Screwtape Letters, published in 1942, that was to catapult Lewis to international fame. And here he is on the front of Time magazine, which was 1947, the period in which he became well known in America. And in fact, Macmillan Press then issued all of his sort of back catalogue as well, and he became extremely well known. And you can see there the little picture of Screwtape the Devil sitting on his shoulder. There's a copy of that in the exhibition, and one of the student primary school groups that Lucy mentioned earlier that we were showing around once looked at it and said to me, "Was he a devil worshipper then?" And I realised that it is a little bit confusing, his heresy, Christianity. And this is taken from a photo shoot that he did for Vogue magazine. I don't know how many Magdalen fellows have ever had a photo shoot in Vogue, but which rather curiously he chose to do in his dressing gown. But he actually did. He was known for wearing his dressing gown a lot because it was so cold in the new buildings in those days when coal was being rationed, and that he commonly taught in his dressing gown. But to do the photo shoot in it was a strange move. But it's interesting, I think, to remember that of course this is before he'd even published the book for which he's best known today. Because The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, the first of the 7 Narnia stories, didn't come out until 1950. So he's already a well-known figure by the time he starts publishing these stories. Why, at this point in his life, did Lewis decide to write children's stories is a question that is often asked. He was in his 40s. He was already a celebrated academic and writer. Why a bachelor don with little contact with children should choose to do that does seem rather strange. And of course, if you go on a C.S. Lewis tour of Oxford, what you'll be told is that the inspiration for the stories lies here in St. Mary's Passage, because one day coming out of the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin on a very snowy winter's night, Lewis apparently came face to face with this doorway where you can see 2 little fawns with their panpipes, and apparently a carved image of a lion in the doorway. And then if you turn to the right, you can see an old-fashioned lamppost. I don't seem to have that picture. Anyway, trust me, there's a lamppost there. And so it's often argued that that was the origin of the Narnia stories. It was that sort of configuration of these fawns, which of course stand in for Mr. Tumnus, that Lucy first meets when she goes through the wardrobe, and then Aslan the lion who comes bounding in later, and the lamppost that she sees in Lantern Waste. So it's easy to imagine that it's the Oxford that he saw around him that was the inspiration for these stories. But actually Lewis tells us a rather different story, because he says that in fact it was seeing pictures in his imagination going back to his childhood that first inspired the story. So he said, as a child I had an image in my mind of a fawn holding brown paper parcels standing in a snowy wood. And then later I had an image of a white witch with a sledge. And it was only in my 40s that I thought to myself, maybe I should try and make a story about it. And the reason that he did it at that point in his life is possibly something to do with the fact that it's at that time in the 1940s that a group of evacuee children moved to his house in Oxford, the Kilns, to stay with him and his housekeeper. Just as it happens at the very beginning of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, if you remember, 4 children evacuated to live with an old professor in a big rambling house somewhere in the countryside. And he says to other people in letters at the time, he said, I never really appreciated children until the war brought them to me. But it's nice to think that here we are at Magdalen, that he was also being inspired by what he saw around him. And there are some examples that I find quite tempting. One is where in the story, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Edmund goes to the witch's palace and finds all of these animals and strange creatures that she's turned into stone standing around. And we're told that they were rather like pieces on a chessboard halfway through the game. These strange centaurs and dragons and weird creatures. And if you look out of that window, you can see, these sort of same strange creatures made of stone, standing as if they could be pieces that could be moved around on a chessboard. But I suspect the place that he found most inspiration for the stories and for the creatures that he meets in them were not around him in Oxford, but rather in the books that he read and studied and taught. And I'll just finish with one example of that, which is here, where all the worst creatures in Narnia congregate at the stone table on the side of the witch. And we learn of ogres with monstrous teeth, and wolves and bull-headed men, spirits of evil trees and poisonous plants, and other creatures whom I won't describe, because if I did, the grown-ups would probably not let you read this book. Cruels and hags and incubuses, wraiths, horrors, efreets, sprites, orkneys, woozes, and etins. They all sound pretty nasty, but I suspect most 11-year-old children don't know what any of these actually are. But the reason is they are kind of literary figures, and particularly well known to those of us who study medieval literature. So Orkneys are the Old English Orkneas, evil spirits. Etins, Old English Eotan, giant. And woozes, Old English Wudu, Waza, a wild man of the woods. Incidentally, all of these characters, of course, crop up in Middle-earth as well, if you're a Tolkien fan. Orcs and Etins more, and Ents and woozes. Tolkien gets them from exactly the same place. And there's a line in Beowulf that describes precisely this, where all these creatures come from, the Eotan and the Orkneas, these giants who strive against God. They are the offspring of Cain, the first murderer. Here it is with Tolkien's own translation of those lines, all these evil broods that come from Cain. And I think that's what's inspiring Lewis here, as it does with Tolkien. So in a sense, it is right, I think, that you can't really imagine Narnia and all of what Lewis produced without thinking of him within his Oxford context. Not necessarily because there are particular buildings and places and statues that we can point to as the inspiration for these stories, but rather because Oxford provided him with a particular environment, people, particularly ones who had similar interests to him, the access to the libraries, the access to the places where he could debate and discuss them, the tutorial spaces, the common rooms, and of course the pubs. These are all things which are, I think, crucial to the extent to which Oxford does create C.S. Lewis. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and then please do go and have a look at the exhibition. Good. Okay, thank you.